Well, hello, and welcome to the Building Podcast. Construction, by any measure, is a significant industry within the UK. Its 2023 value was a record high of £139 billion, delivered by 365,000 VAT registered firms who employ between them 1.4 million people. In addition to this, there are around 750,000 self-employed workers. The diversity, depth and breadth of our sector makes meaningful decisions across the whole sector challenging unless we have meaningful strategic data. We may be good at basing decisions on our own experiences and anecdotal case studies, but we run the risk of missing the bigger picture or experiencing a range of unintended consequences. So today, we have the opportunity to unpack some of this data in relation to our productivity and ranking around the world. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Max Wilkes to the Building Podcast. Max is an Associate Director of Atkins Realis, and he's heavily involved in identifying, challenging, and interpreting the data that comes from our industry. Max, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Not at all. Max, we normally start by giving our interviewees a chance to sort of explain what they do within their companies and how that really can impact some of the work that the company does within their sectors.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Max Wilkes, and I joined Faithful & Gould as it was back in 2019 as our market intelligence lead. Since then, we've rebranded as Atkins Realis, so taking Faithful & Gould, Atkins, and our Canadian parent company, SNC Lavalins, all together. So you may not be familiar with Atkins Realis as such. But going back to my role, I've actually worked in cost intelligence teams since the mid-90s. So that's 30 years of experience, and included other big consultants such as Gartner and Theobald and Davis Langdon. And I'm responsible for gathering all the information that comes from various sources. So whether it's someone in our London office is telling me something, someone in our Glasgow office or Dublin, I'm there pulling together all the sources, trying to knit together the threads and highlight future trends and problems. And more often than not, it does seem like problems. You may have read. Well, is that enough, Mark? Or
no, that's fine. I'm very happy. You know, I think it allows us to set the scene on what we're doing. Let me come back with a separate question. So we met after the Constructing Excellence Summit in Birmingham, which was only 3 months after the general election, and you introduced a concept about the 100-day economy after the election. We're now nearly 6 months after the election, but the bit that impressed me, and I think impressed the audience, was your data approach to demonstrating what was going on within the industry and how that was happening. So perhaps it's worth sort of explaining a little bit about why the importance of that data-led decisions and those discussions that you're having.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm glad I impressed you with the presentation. So what I should say is that, you know, my role's been around for decades, as my experience shows. And I actually joined pre-internet, so there was no online information. So we used to get BCIS published quarterly in the paperback copies. We didn't see ONS data. But now we've got all this, we've got powerful tools to interrogate it all. So we can go through and look at how things are going. I think at the presentation that Mark referred to, I put a graph up showing how material prices have changed month on month over, since January 2020, which, as most of us think about, is the last normal month of the decade before we had 3.5 years of utter chaos. And when you compare that, the material costs going up, peaking at an annual increase of 26% following the Ukraine invasion, and you plot it against how labour costs have gone to see how they compare in a trend-wise against the output costs, it's really fascinating. Materials went up labour started gradually going up. And at one point in, I think it's mid 23, labour overtook materials. And since that point, materials have been stable, but labour's been going up. So this indicates that labour is now the main cost driver. And then you start throwing that in with ONS figures showing employment within the industry, how it's fallen from something like 2.8 million just before the pandemic. And we're at 2.1 million now. And those figures don't represent the collapse of ISG and other firms going into insolvency this autumn. So we may potentially even drop below 2 million, which shows how short we are in the labour force, which will therefore drive labour wage agreements up higher. And you have to remember that this is all the way from the food chain, or all the way down the food chain. So as an old QS, I should say that QS sits at the top, and then we've got all the tradespeople, and I'm not going to say where architects sit, just in case there's any listeners. So yeah, they go all the way down, and then we've got new emerging trends and trades coming on. So we've got all the skills needed for decarbonomics or decarbonisation. Sorry. So people have got to be trained in that, and then you can look at age demographics as well. So I could go on, but it's really fascinating to see, and you can start identifying trends and how they will influence others. And then hopefully we can be one step ahead in trying to provide accurate and reliable information to our clients and colleagues.
Yeah, and I think that's really the importance of it, isn't it? It's being able to predict how those changes are going to go, and be able to tell the industry that we're now in a labour-led price increases is quite important, and be able to then allow us to start managing it. And I think that drop of nearly 700 to 800,000 people out of the industry at a time when actually the amount of work we'd expected to do is increasing. As I said at the intro, record-breaking year of 139 billion pounds done last in 2023. It does show that there must be an increase in productivity, one would hope, if we're doing more with less people. Or perhaps we're just, perhaps you can tell us we're being busy fools. I don't know, but it's those sort of decisions which I can see are really quite important.
Yes, it's interesting as well, Mark, that output since the pandemic has risen by 4%, and yet we've lost 800,000 people. So that must show that we're getting more productive. And we do talk about modular building and that it's not taken off in the UK, and we're still at the same stage as we were 15 years ago. But it's not just modular, but we're doing more prefabricated work. So we're getting on site, and you can fit in place M&E modules just, as in one go, or, facades as well. So we are taking advantage of fabrication.
So do those figures that we talk about include people working and building these things in factories, or are they part of the manufacturing sector and not the construction sector?
They tend to be, I think, in the manufacturing sector.
Right. So we could have moved people out of construction into manufacturing. Part of those 800,000 may have gone that way. Is that possible, or is that too simplistic?
That's definitely possible. I don't think there's any simple explanation for it. I mean, people leave because of other factors. We lost a lot because of the pandemic. People, retired, decided to find another job. When we have our online shopping delivered, how many of those, used to work in a different industry to what they do now and decided to take the opportunity to move on?
Yeah. And I certainly on my sites I was involved with, we lost a lot of Europeans back to the European countries, partly Brexit, but mostly actually due to COVID. And when lockdown happened across Europe, they all returned back to their original, their countries of origin.
Yeah.
Well, it's probably worth saying a little bit about productivity then in general, because this is something that, I'm well aware that if we want to pay ourselves more money, and you're telling us that labour prices are increasing, generally the only place that can come from is increases in productivity, unless we're going to start charging our clients significantly more and pass those costs straight through. Can you tell us a little bit about how productivity has moved over the last 10 years?
Generally, the whole economy has improved slightly. I mean, we still lag behind other countries, like Germany, for instance, for overall productivity in the economy. But then when you look at construction sector as a whole, don't actually lag that far behind other countries, you know.
Okay.
So you have to ask yourself why we're not productive. And I don't know whether the listeners have had the opportunity to look at the headlines from the National Infrastructure Council assessment of how things have been on infrastructure projects and the way they've compared rail, nuclear, and road. For instance, with road, we're actually one of the lowest cost countries for roads, but that's because we build roads constantly. So we've got the labour force in there with the right skills and the supply chain to meet the demand for the roads. But then why is HS2 so expensive? You know, when we built HS1, it cost the same amount as the first Spanish high-speed train line. But now Spain has something like 3,000 kilometers of high-speed train lines because they continued to build them. And infrastructure makes productivity quicker because you're not stuck on the motorway or your train's late. But because they carried on building, they kept the same skills in place, and the supply chains were there to meet the demand. Whereas we waited 19 years for a new HS or for HS2 to come along. So we've got to relearn the skills. We've got to get the supply chain up and running. So we're not going to be as productive, are we? If we carried on with phase 2A, going up to Manchester and over to Leeds, then that's going to be built quicker because we've got the skills in place, and it's going to be cheaper to build because we've got the knowledge. It's the same with nuclear power stations. We built Hinkley Point, I always get them mixed up, and then 19 years later we're on Sizewell, or vice versa. But it's the same scenario, and we wonder why costs are so expensive.
And I think the interesting point for me, Max, is that you're talking about the whole construction process there, aren't you? From planning right the way through to land acquisition, right the way through to design, through design into delivery and planning and project management of all these really very sophisticated jobs. So it is not just the sort of what you might call the biblical trades that are required to build these things.
No, it's the same with house builders. It will often take 2 years to get from purchase of land, design, putting it into planning to getting planning approval. So is it going to be in the right cycle to build the homes to meet the demand?
Yeah, and I think in many of our house builders would think that 2 years in planning would be a huge improvement if it's from where they're currently standing.
Yes, perhaps I was being a bit optimistic there.
Real issue there.
Yeah.
So a bit that I suppose worth just exploring this productivity question again, because if we really have lost 800,000 people out of the sector, can we and productivity hasn't really moved? Are we saying that that we are reliant then on those prefabrications? Does that explain why productivity hasn't moved? Is that we're still using the same number of people on site as we used to, but only we've got some of them moved on to construction into factories? It's a conundrum. I just perhaps needs worthy of an explanation.
Yes, I hadn't really thought about that, to be honest, Mark, before you brought that idea up. If we are comparing the productivity to output compared to people building it, then it has gone up.
Yeah.
And those in the manufacturing part are, they're not skilled workers that we associate with being on site. So they're not bricklayers, plasterers, or the like. They're there, they're assembling everything, and then it's being shipped out. That labour source is cheaper, so that would help with the productivity.
Yeah. So Max, just keep staying with productivity at the moment then. What are the key issues that affect productivity and the areas we ought to be focusing on to try and get those improvements?
Okay, I think that we need to develop more pipelines of work going forward. We've spoken about the labour shortages. Are you going to invest in someone if 5 or 10 years down the road, you don't know if they're going to be needed, whether the skills that you're training in them now are relevant for 5 years down the road? But if you know you're going to have so much work coming down the pipeline, so whether if you're involved in, say, building a school or hospital, that there's going to be so many coming in your local area, then you can help train your workforce up for those skills needed. You can invest in new technology to make sure that you're able to work and do it quicker. You can invest in the new carbon-friendly cranes, for instance, or train someone to install heat pumps. So it's one of those things that the government quite rightly have said we're going to develop 10-year strategies, and we're going to focus on these particular industries, and we're going to get them rolling. So get those pipelines in place so that we can see what skills we need going forward, and then let's ensure that we do train people. Probably, we cut investment during slow times. Is that the right time to do it? Surely we should be training people during a downturn so that when the upturn comes, we've got people ready to pick the tools up and work, rather than saying, oh, we haven't got the capacity now. So, if you build up the capacity during the lean period, then you can meet the troughs. But hopefully the consistent pipeline would ease out the peaks and troughs, so it's a more steady one. Let's get this joined up thinking going on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, a couple of questions there. I mean, just on the pipelines. I mean, pipelines traditionally have been, aspirational at best, as when the government produces a pipeline of work. And there's some concern around about in the industry of whether those pipelines can actually be delivered. And the second aspect is that whilst they might focus on some of the large jobs that are out there, they're not focusing on some of the jobs which small regional companies do, who are actually going to do the bulk of the training that you talk about being so important. Is there any way of squaring those two circles? I mean, can you comment on the accuracy of the pipelines that we've had previously? And I can think of a few government initiatives to produce pipelines, and how we can get some confidence down into the industry to get that training done at the smaller and lower levels.
Yes, it's getting that confidence. I mean, back in 2015, I think it was, George Osborne said, oh, we're going to invest £100 billion in infrastructure, and he's going to sell off state assets. So we're kind of back to square one. We didn't have that building boom then, due to a number of reasons that we all know about. Yeah. But yes, it's getting that confidence down the line, because it's not tier one contractors who employ the workers. It's tier two, tier three. They're the ones who take the workforce on and get the work actually built. So we do need to see how we can get the work, ensure that the work goes to them and get their confidence in it. And a lot of it as well is, looking after these firms as well. We know the frightening levels of insolvency that we're going through. We've seen the effects of how we've lost, I think it's £4.5 billion when you take some of the larger contractors out who have gone bust, like Buckingham, Reedy, and so on, Lonsdale, and the skills lost there. And often that, we lose those skills. People just move on to other industries and don't come back.
Yeah. I mean, I think those losses are really pertinent, aren't they? I mean, you're talking about an industry turning over 139 billion. You lose 4.5 billion out of that over, well, I suppose Carillion's now, 6 years ago. You're almost of the same sort of magnitude as the profits that have come out of the sector in a period of time. I mean,
yes.
it's madness, isn't it?
I was speaking to one of my colleagues who looks after West Wales, and he said that if they've had a pre-pandemic, he would have 10 regional contractors who he could turn to for a tender list. Now he's down to about 3 reliable ones. And that just shows the scale of the losses. And with that, the supply chain becomes smaller, therefore that pushes costs up, and people are less likely to want to invest because it's not affordable or viable for them.
I mean, I don't know whether you can tell me or not, but the ISG has gone down just over £1 billion, I believe. That's staggering. That's over, it's nearly half its turnover in terms of debt. Do we know what the impact is likely to be on the industry? Do we know if most of those people are going to find jobs in other companies? It's inevitably going to take quite a lot of the supply chain to the wall, who are not being paid that £1 billion. But presumably those people can go, they're not lost to the industry totally. A lot of those people will go and find work elsewhere. I mean, I recall Carillion teams were picked up wholesale, weren't they, by many of their Carillion's competitors. I suppose the question is, should we be worried that we're losing those skills out of the sector forever?
We will lose some people. I've been speaking to a couple of contractors, and they've picked up people from ISG, and it's one of these things. We move around companies, don't we, Mark? Is that I spoke about who I'd worked for in the past. I keep bumping into them, and we move companies. People get a reputation within the industry, so even site workers, they can go from say one of our local contractors to another one, and then you see them working on a house extension down the road with a different name on their van. So there is that. People know who the good workers are, and they will always find work.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that's right, and let's keep fingers crossed for the majority that are affected, that they do find valuable and suitable work going forward.
Yes.
Just moving on the subject then, and really keeping with trying to understand the figures that we're presented with. One of the things which I find challenging is how you measure value in our industry. We're quite good at measuring cost.
Yes.
And I wonder, in the productivity calculations that government pushes out, whether they have a formal way of measuring value, or is it all just done on the numbers?
Sometimes I think value is subjective. I recently had a house extension, and stop me if this is not really relevant, Mark, but
no, I think it's great to bring it down to things that people understand.
Yeah. So basically, I had a house extension. Before we bought the house, there was a 1970s extension. It was probably previously a garage, but you'd step down into it to get there. The kitchen was on, you'd have to step down to open another door, step down, step up to go to an unheated toilet. To go to the garage, you'd have to go outside. It was all cold and dark. So basically, we decided enough was enough. We had a budget, and the work came in on budget, or in fact less than budget. perhaps being an old QS, I put too much contingencies in. But when we measure the work, we measure it on value. It achieved all we wanted to. The house is nice and warm now, because obviously the 70s extension didn't have insulation. It's all insulated now. The kitchen's 100 times better. It's all on one level. So, you know, going forward, you know, if access becomes a problem, it's great. We only added 2 meters squared of floor space and converted the garage into a utility and storeroom, because after all, who uses a garage for cars now? So yeah, value-wise, it ticked the boxes, came in under budget, like I said, so that was great. Then, to use a developer's phrase of exit strategy, we obviously developed it. You know, would it meet the capital we put in? Would it meet what we'd achieve extra from selling on? But to us, that wasn't a point.
No.
So when we look at value and cost, we have to look at it through the end user's point of view, which I've just explained mine, which was successful. But then, you know, for a developer, they've got to meet, you know, that viability. If they build a office block, you know, are they going to do it to, you know, prime office and achieve, say, £40 per square foot, which you can get in Birmingham? Because if they can't, then that makes the project unviable. So, you know, with the costs going on, going up and up, you know, you have a certain spec, you know, whether it's metal tiled suspended ceilings, you know, and I go around various offices and I can see the difference in spec between them, but that's often because of what we pay per square foot. And, you know, developers have to get their margins for it.
Yeah. And I suppose the question is really trying to understand how that value is measured. You can understand the specification going out. You can understand the costs coming back in, and you know, we always used to measure pretty much time, cost, and quality, how much over budget or we were delivering projects for. And we used to have measures given by Constructing Excellence for how many projects were delivered on time and to budget. I suppose it's trying to understand that measurement of value is really the key. It's a challenge, I think, for the industry, particularly when you're trying to make sort of generalized decisions across the industry. It's quite an challenging issue. Yeah,
I just think, you know, everyone's got their own ideas of what their value is. You know, you know, an office block, does it achieve the yield that it wants? If not, then, you know, that development's not met its value.
No, it's been overspec'd, hasn't it? And perhaps that puts a different complexion on the bats for the HS2 bat building that's just been commissioned at many millions of pounds worth of value. Perhaps the bats put a very different value on it from us paying public. Who knows?
Yes, definitely.
Who knows? Let's move on a bit, Max. One of the things that interests me is we keep being told that the UK is one of the most expensive countries in the world to build in. Is that fact or is that fiction?
Yeah, we see all the figures, and I agree. We are one of the most expensive places to build. There are a few more expensive. Switzerland jumps to mind in Europe.
Right.
But you know, if you compare ourselves to, say, India, you know, our wages are so much higher. So therefore, it is going to cost more. Are materials cheaper between here and India? I couldn't honestly tell you that, Mark. I presume they'd probably be a bit cheaper in India. But, you know, for instance, material prices here have gone up by 38% since January 20, and a staggering 65% since Brexit in 2016.
Gosh,
right.
Amazing,
so,
isn't it?
You know, that's going to push it up. And let's just compare it to one of our closest European neighbours, the Netherlands. Material prices there have gone up by less than 25% since January 20. So what's going on there? I don't have an answer. Is it import tariffs coming in place. That could be a part of it, but most of our goods that we import for construction is through China. So I don't think there's been any increases in tariffs there. So, I don't know. I don't know why we're so expensive, really. But that's a few things. So, labour's more expensive. Do we spec higher than other countries? We might do, but then we see glorious buildings being built everywhere else, and you think, wow, wish we could do that here. But
do you think there's I mean, I interviewed an architect who was sort of saying in the sort of 30 years he'd been in practice, the number of professionals that are now involved in any building has just proliferated out of all recognition from when he started 30 years ago, all with their own specialisms, all with their own, in his views, costs that are being added into the project. And he's, being a traditional architect, he wasn't convinced that they all added the value relative to the cost that was being charged. But that was what was expected by the system to bring a project into fruition. Do you think some of those costs, those relative costs around the world, could be due to these additional professionals and the workload that they bring with them? I mean, there are, we're now much more wary of acoustics. We're much more wary of carbon. We're much more wary of the whole environmental issues. They all have value, but presumably, do they have values that aren't recognised around the world? Is that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, all the carbon experts are all. It's a new profession, isn't it? And do all countries adhere to the same standards that we're aiming for? We hear about high polluting countries like, say, China and in India. So do they have their carbon experts trying to reduce carbon? Are they so, like you said, so in tune with acoustics? I worked on one project and they were putting a box in a box in a basement because it was by an underground line in central London. So I mean, that added, say 0.5% onto the cost of the professional fees for the project as well. So like you said, they all mount up, and perhaps going back 30 years ago, the architect would have done so many more roles for his fee, and that his fee hasn't gone up or down because he's not doing that. Same with the QSs. We would have done some things, but now we've got health and safety advisors adding things on, or principal design roles as well. So it's.
I don't suppose there's any way of addressing that other than if the UK starts losing projects to overseas because we've priced ourselves out of the market. I'm not sure how we get that recognition and whether that's a role for government then to step in to say we need to do something about this.
That's right. But I think one of the things as well is that what you've got to think about is Britain is a good place for people to invest in. I was at a recent conference and one of the speakers was saying that Britain is looking very favourable for overseas investment at the moment. People are wary of what Donald Trump's going to bring to the States and is inward looking. But it's not just that. In Europe, we've seen the rise of populist right-wing parties taking place. And, we've seen that in Germany, Netherlands, Austria, to name a few. And, multinational companies are wary of political instability. So they think, Britain looks pretty stable at the moment. It might cost a few more pounds, but we're not going to be in a political environment that might change overnight.
So, I mean, that's really good news. I suppose, is there anything we ought to be able to export, or that expertise we ought to be able to export to the rest of the world? I mean, you talk about carbon, and that's clearly a growth agenda across the world. Are there any other areas that you see the UK has a core expertise in that we could be maximising overseas?
There's plenty of opportunities. You know, for instance, Crossrail, we learned a lot about tunneling on that. We set up a national academy for training tunnellers. So there's that possibility there. For instance, there's only four companies in Europe that have the ability to tunnel between what's called cross tunneling between underground lines. So, Crossrail's has just finished, but then, there's other big underground or metro systems taking place. So, to employ one of those is, you're competing against people, but then, the skills that we've picked up from designing Crossrail, HS2, we can export those, perhaps, all the mega projects that are going on in the Middle East, for instance, there is that opportunity there.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, and it's good to hear that we have some skills left in the UK that we can export and go and do work elsewhere, because I'm aware that our share of international trade has fallen significantly since the Second World War, where we did, I believe it was nearly a quarter of all international trade after the Second World War. We're now down to somewhere over 1.5%, aren't we? But
yeah, I should say actually, my role in the United States is actually covered by an Englishman. He used to work for us in the UK, and he moved over there, and he heads up the US branch of the intelligence.
Okay, good. So there shouldn't be anything lost in communication then.
No.
That's good. Max, let's just come on to the role of government in improving industry. I mean, I do worry that we're in a highly fragmented industry. There's nobody really controls or manages construction as a whole. Government's there to set the environment we work in, and is there anything that they ought to be doing to improve efficiencies or effectiveness of our industry?
We've touched on pipelines before, Mark. So they can get those industrial strategies in place and assist with pipelines, so that we know that we're going to need data centers, roads, hopefully more high-speed train lines, and so on. They can also invest in education, so they can set up training colleges, invest in youngsters coming into the industry, because there is an almighty shortage of those. So we've got the pipeline, we've got the training, the planning reforms as well. There's been some important first steps there, and we've got to get that joining the dots up between all of them, get the planning reforms in place so we can get the project started, but then make sure they get onto the site. Government could help by the training people, so the supply chains there, lift paperwork, perhaps try and ensure that importing goods into the country's more easy, and it's not obstructed by red tape. They talk about getting prompt payments in place for the subcontractors. They could ensure that they are in place and contractors adhere to that. I don't know. I mean, do they blacklist contractors and say, well, we're not going to employ you on public work because you're not paying the contractors, your subcontractors quick enough? But then, it's proving that there are routes that the government can do and hopefully, improve the industry. But, it's not just the government. We have to help ourselves as well. We have to ensure that we invest in training and new technology as much as possible, because that makes us more productive. It makes us more favorable to investment. When there's a downturn, it often seems the more inexperienced people are let go, which I suppose makes commercial sense. But then someone's just done 3 years of training and they're just starting to find their feet. They think, well, is that going to happen? I'll go back into the industry. A year's time, I get let go again. It's not encouraging people. And to be honest, it took me years to become a proficient QS before I moved into this role.
It's a real challenge, isn't it? I mean, we need to,
Yes.
that longevity of experience is actually what makes us competent at what we do, as you say, and
Yes.
that's part of. I mean, I think you're sort of what I'm hearing then, Max, is that we ought to be focusing on running our businesses rather than running our projects. And I often think if we have a project focus on our businesses, we tend to think about a sort of 6-month business horizon, whereas you're talking about horizons that measured in career, lengths of career, and that journey through our working lives is actually what we expect particularly our larger businesses to be focusing on.
I think so, because just one more personal antidote. I was once described by one of my bosses as being too nice to be a QS. Right. And, I was thinking about this last night, actually, and I thought, that's a nice compliment. I like to think that I'm a nice person. My role involves going out of my way to help people, and I always take time to help graduates, explain to them what's going on, to get them to think about things in a broader experience away from just a project. That you're too nice to be a QS actually sums up the faults of our industry. Is that being a QS is you want things delivered on time, on cost, particularly as a QS. So we're all focused on our individual goals, but do we look at it in a wider perspective? And if we're nice to other people, they contract springs to mind, and actually work with them and help with them to overcome problems, then does that make the industry better? Because if we focus on our own individual goals, it means that we miss our collective goals as an industry, making the industry worse. And the last thing someone wants to do is invest in our industry when they hear about projects delayed, projects over time, projects over cost.
It's what you're saying is I mean, I always say it's be fair.
Yes.
Rather than necessarily kind, but be, and be quick. Don't sit on the fence longer than you have to make decisions, because there are difficult decisions to make on all projects, and that's
right.
They need to be made.
Yes.
Max, I'm very aware of the time, and thank you very much for investing so far. I'm going to ask an entirely unfair question though to start with, to finish up with.
Right.
And I say, bearing in mind that this podcast goes out across the industry, but quite often to regional and local contractors up and down the nation. You've talked around, and the question really is, what are the sort of the 3 big things that the data is telling us that where we're heading at the moment? Now, you've talked around about wage increases being the primary driver for costs. What else is the data telling us? Is it sort of carbon's going to become important, or we're going to need to be with training more? I don't know. What would your recommendation be, looking at the data that you've got in front of you?
I would say invest in people and technology. They'll help us to build faster, build better. Carbon is going to be important. It's part of the wider drive by government that we're going to become a net zero economy.
Yeah.
So look at investing in that. Infrastructure is important. The current government is keen on that, but I think as well is look at insolvencies, look how we can try and avoid them, whether it's quicker payment, whether it's building up a robust supply chain that we're not so quick to close plants down at the slightest hint of a downturn and then waiting for them to be to come back online and causing supply chains and more costs. So it's, I think, looking at all this, what I'm saying is don't look at tomorrow, look further ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So we with the amount of change that we're all facing at the moment, we need to have that further horizon. And for me, it comes back to focusing on your business, not necessarily on your project. Focusing on your career, not necessarily your job at the moment you're dealing with at the moment. It's that much longer term view. And interesting, you're focusing on payment as well. I mean, I interviewed Jarvie Moss of Sable for a podcast, and he has exactly that view. If we can solve or reduce the risk of payment, both from the funder right the way through the supply chain, that unlocks a huge amount of value, which is very economic to unlock, but also provides much fairer terms for payment. And if you're less likely to lose, in ISG's case, £1 billion out of the industry if they've been paid through a project bank account and their supply chain had been paid at the same time. May have lost ISG much earlier, but that's they wouldn't have had the impact on the industry that they're undoubtedly going to have.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Max, it's been a fantastic trip through the data and through where we ought to be doing, where we ought to be focusing. Thank you very much for your time, and wish you every success at Atkins Realis in informing the industry on the things we ought to be doing.
Right. Thank you, Mark, and thank you again for inviting me on. A real pleasure.